great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Timothy Hyman. Timothy is a graduate of the Slade School of Art, 1967. He's a figurative painter, art writer and curator. He was elected a Royal Academician in 2011. He's exhibited widely throughout his career and has had to date 9 major solo exhibitions in London. Tim has curated exhibitions at the Tate, the ICA and the Hayward galleries. He's a celebrated writer of numerous articles and publications, and his most recent book, The World New Made, which you saw an image of in the beginning, The World New Made, Figurative Painting in the 20th Century, has been highly praised, described by one reviewer, Christopher Allen, as a delight, deeply but lightly erudite, intimate, written with exquisite intelligence. And I think when you hear Tim talking about his work and his practice, you'll see that and hear that. Tim's work's always touched me as generous and curious, with a kind of innocence, a quality of attention to the fleeting moments that make up our everyday. He emphasised in his teaching the importance of observing and drawing from life, but not in a narrow, realistic way. Just simply the pleasure and benefit of observing, whether it's in the city, on the bus, for example, simply looking and looking again more deeply at the infinite complexity unfolding in front of us. And this seems to me akin to a mindfulness meditation, a taking in of what is. And I feel when we see his work, we can enter into a similar mindset. And it seems to me, it reminds me of a Kafka saying, when you look deeply and observe, the world freely offers itself to you to be unmasked, rolling in ecstasy at our feet. So in his life and dealings with people, Tim can also be very generous. He has mentored and influenced many young artists in his various roles, speaking, teaching and writing. I'm sure we have several of these people here in the audience tonight, and I'd like to invite them at the end to make themselves known. So I hand you over to Tim with great anticipation. I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for clocking in. I haven't done quite this kind of lecture by Zoom before. Can you all hear me pretty well? Perfectly all right? Yeah. About the right pitch or a bit loud? Am I talking a bit loud?
No, it's fine.
It's all right? Okay.
It's fine. Absolutely fine, Tim.
So I want to just say that this whole thing of looking back at 74, which is what one does, you see, is very different to say what Melissa Keim was doing, whatever it was, 2 or 3 weeks ago, in that her life is before her. Now, I hope that quite a lot of my life is still before me, but inevitably one tries to assess and think about the past. If you're been around for 50 years of painting, and you can't possibly get it all in. On the other hand, there is this strange continuity that we all have. Constable said, the artist only paints one picture. Now, I think what he meant was not formulaic, but more that we aspire to a certain idea about a kind of painting. And I will be partly talking about that. And in different ways, one repeatedly strives and perhaps doesn't quite hit it. So you're driven on to try again and try again. But there is a certain continuity. So maybe we should just start with the first image. Actually, the first image wasn't that, so yeah, that's all. Okay, good. So if I had to say what my archetypal picture that I'm trying for, this would be fairly much an example. It's about 5 years ago now. They tend to go on rather long. So if I say it's 5 years ago, it probably means it started 7 or 8 years ago. And the title of this picture is Melancholy in the City of Our Life. Now, I will come back to it at the end anyway, but I just want to suggest that the kind of painting I'm heading towards is what you might call an altarpiece. In other words, it's not really just an easel picture. It's something like a thwarted well, it could be a mural, or it could be something a bit bigger than an easel picture. And in that, I think I share that with a lot of 20th century artists and 21st century artists who perhaps feel that the commodification of the little easel picture that we all sell, you know, some very good artists, Van Gogh painted one a day. We don't really want that necessarily. Some of us want to try and make a painting that includes everything we have to say. And it would probably be many layered. It would perhaps be complex. I think it would have to be complex in my case. And it might have different states of mind within the same picture. You might have despair or total disillusionment, and then you might have re-illusionment. You might have a sense of awakening to hope again. I'm just freewheeling, but the complexity is sort of part of the deal for me. And exactly what that comes out of, it's not terribly easy for me to say, but it does come out of things like loving cinema, loving to read long, complex novels. I was particularly influenced, I'm not going to bring this in again, but I was particularly influenced by a specific novelist called John Cooper Purse, an English novelist who isn't very well known, but did big panoramic, kind of all over the place novels. And from the beginning, I mean, 10 years before I ever exhibited, I was reading these novels and thinking about them and thinking that that was the kind of painting I wanted to paint. So what goes into one's painting is much more than just other paintings or art ideas. It's the totality of a life. Yeah, I think maybe I said an altarpiece, let's say a wall. I mean, I've never been able to get a proper mural commission. I've not tried that hard. I probably should have been more wily or strategic about it. But in a way, that was what formed me, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's go on to another one. Let's really say a year or two after. And that's called Divided Self, Works of Mercy. So the idea of the self as being multiple, and of the world as being multiple, many things having to cram in different compartments, different phases of being, our ethnicities. You know, I'm half Jewish. I'm half. I remember asking an Italian friend, "Am I really that English?" And he did this wonderful Italian gesture of shaking his hand. And so one's very English, but I've learned quite late in life that I was partly Indian. I spent a lot of time in India. I'm partly feminine. I'm partly riddled with death, you know. So all the components of the self are partly, I think, what a lot of my bigger pictures are about, and whether one can hold it all. You will have noticed that in both these pictures, Saturn is a feature, and in some ways, within my development from about 19, the myth of there being the possible return through melancholy, in fact, through the myth of Saturn's rule. Saturn was the god of the Golden Age, this mythical time before gender, nation, all the hierarchical and oppositional things, but when things were, as it were, wide open. And I do subscribe to that mythology of a golden age being what we must aspire to again. So there are all those things are also driving me on. Okay, another one. I'll come back to that too. An extra level of complexity for me is that although I suppressed writing for many years, right through the Slade. I hardly even attended art history lectures. And I didn't really begin to write with any seriousness until I was about 25. And then the first thing I published was on Fellini, not on art. Nevertheless, it's become a big strand in my life. And the gear change is very awkward. And I'm interested in that. I really do think that I feel it physically, that there's a different side of the brain that is engaged when you paint and when you write. And on the whole, I find painting, I feel well afterwards. And I mean, eventually I have a bad time sometimes, of course, but when I come out of the studio, I feel refreshed. When I write, I'm scrunched up, I'm physically in a bad way often. And it is a different sort of activity, and you're using a different mechanism. After all, writing is very recent. Writing is only 6,000 years maximum. You know, less than 100 people of my age would take you back to before writing. Think of that. I'm aware of it as quite an awkward thing, writing, but it's definitely been helpful to me in kind of keeping me from being overwhelmed by resentments and pus and anger, and which I think a lot of artists of my age, I'm afraid, do feel as they get older. And it's helped me in many ways. I think not to, I don't think I've illustrated my writing, as it were, but I do think it's helped me keep them parallel and uncluttered. It's somehow, some of the clutter went into writing, which I think otherwise would have gone into painting, even more cluttered. Let's have the first other slide. Next one, yeah. So I arrived at the Slade very young. I got in at 16, and I was 17 when I started, which was much younger than the majority of other people, although there were others. And it was a very sophisticated art school. And in many ways, it was terrifying when I look back. I mean, I would say, I think this is normal, but I would say it took me roughly 3 years to recover from each year I spent at art school. So I would say 10 years passed before I would feel free of art school. But nevertheless, in my first term at art school, I did this big project, you see, this big painting, which is called Me and My Friends. And it's an adolescent painting, but you can see straight away that there's certain continuities there. What makes it even more complicated is that I really was a very, very engaged childhood painter, probably more than most. I even exhibited and so on. And when I was at my worst moment at the Slade, I rediscovered these paintings in an outhouse, really. And it helped me. It helped remind me that I really had loved the experience of sitting down for 45 minutes or whatever it was, an art class or even at home, and coming out with something very direct. And I've often said I peaked at 11. I peaked at 11 in the sense that there's that directness that I think many people in this room surely remember. I wouldn't be the only one. It so happens that some of the great artists like Matisse didn't do childhood paintings. He really wasn't an artist until he was in his 20s. But in my case, I'd been up and down quite a lot already. I mean, I'd peaked at 11, I'd lost it, which happens often at puberty. I got it back in a sort of form, a sort of realist painting. And the moment I got to the Slade, I tried to paint whatever you like to call it, an altarpiece or a mural or whatever. And it was about the split life that I was having, on the one hand, in a horrible boarding school, hateful, but full of amorous adventures, and on the other hand, in a sort of adolescent gang group in London. And I think it's quite interesting as a painting. But of course it was a stony silence. It was completely not what I should be engaging in, someone like the Slade, either the hard line measuring thing or the onset of modernism and abstraction, which was totally dominant by then. This was the mid-60s. This is 1963. So they'd had about 4 years of the American painting tsunami completely sweeping everyone away in England. And I knew nothing of that, really. So the big shock, I went, let's try the next one, yeah. Next one. Next slide, yeah. In my ardent way, you see, I'd managed to persuade my parents to let me just travel initially. I suppose I was 6 years, travel initially and see all the things I wanted to see. And the thing, I think from the beginning, the thing that affected me most was Siena. And eventually, years later, I would write a book. Sorry. I would write a book on Sienese painting. Can I hold this up?
Yep.
Yeah, some of you will know this. But anyway, so that's actually still available, that book. And with Lorenzetti, Ambrogio Lorenzetti at the heart of it. And actually, 2 years ago, I got back to Siena for a wonderful Lorenzetti retrospective, the first there'll ever, I think the first and perhaps the last there'll ever be. And can I just, just to give you a bit of evidence, can I hold up something else? These are just two sort of 12-year-old little book things of, wait a minute.
I see that, yeah.
Better? Is that better?
Yeah, that's good.
Of devils, a troop of devils arriving, a magical incantation. And I can see that there's some continuity between that and what I do now. You know, I don't feel totally alien to them. And there's quite a lot else, but that gives you some idea. Now, let's go back to the main, yeah. So when I got into this extraordinary room that I think many of you have probably seen, which is that wall of the well-governed city, that utopian wall, which says so much about the nature of our hopes. But it also has many features that will stay with me forever, like a curved horizon. Can you see that curved horizon? The sense of the enclosing wall of the city, the sense of, it's 44 foot long, and it's painted with a wonderful sort of touch. It's not like a Hammy Rivera, you know, the worst kind of Mexican mural, let's say, which is filled in drawing. It's not like that. It's painted with lovely touch. So it's an amazing work, and it goes on for me resonating. And I think it did from the beginning. And so there's some funny little echo of that, I think, in that first painting. Next slide. Next slide. But then what happened is that I suddenly found myself in a world where Barnett Newman, who was afraid of red, yellow, and blue, was the order of the day, really. And I admire Newman and still do admire him. But it was a tremendous stranglehold that American painting came to have in that period. And I wasn't strong enough to dig my heels in, and I, in a way, I'm glad I didn't. And I took it on, and I fell apart, as many do. It's a 4-year course. You had 2 years to fall apart, and I was very much afraid of red, yellow, and blue. I mean, to some extent, that whole formal language seemed to negate so obviously whatever I was getting. I mean, can we go back to the Lorenzetti? Just remember. Go back to the Lorenzetti. Go back. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, one thing I haven't spoken about yet is spatiality. And in a way, that's the key for me. I think painting, a lot of my favorite painting, and I think a lot of everyone's favorite painting, is about deep illusionistic space and moving around in it and finding ways of talking about spatiality. And that was always known. I mean, even if you read early aestheticians on painting, space is one of the things that painting did. But I happened to come into art school at just the moment when that had been, all illusionism had been ordered out. And it was very tough. I mean, the thing I really wanted to do was completely off the menu. And so now we can move forward. And what was in a way moving and fascinating in all this was it wasn't just a formal thing with Newman or with any of the others, with Rothko, obviously not. It was a confrontation with the nothingness, the void. And I don't know how much that means to young artists now, but I think it does mean a lot to my generation, whatever their persuasion. And my book, The World New Made, is partly about the way that people, as it were, bounce off the void into creating a new world of forms. In other words, unlike, say, academic painting, or indeed unlike, say, Euston Road drawing, you're not taking the world as being this solid thing that you've got to record. You're taking it to be ultimately nothingness. And I took this on so seriously, and I think a lot of other people did, that I couldn't possibly put a line round it, you see. Now, I'm just showing you this because somebody just sent it to me. They picked it up somewhere. I'd forgotten it, but I think it must come from that period just falling apart. And it was an attempt at self-portrait. And you can see it, me almost literally obliterating myself as I painted. I'm sure that's my lips and my eye, obviously. But I couldn't possibly paint a self-portrait. I couldn't draw. The void was all dominant. And it was exactly at that point that the image of melancholia and the idea that I won't show you Dürer's Melancholia, and the idea of coming to terms with this, in a way, almost making a cult of unhappiness, of negation, hit me, and at some level remained the basis of my worldview. I'm not but little by little, I came to think that the meaning was in the cycle of it. You know, Saturn is a cycle, and what interests me now is the hope side of it rather than the despair side of it. Let's have another one. So I think it was my last year at the Slade, I'd started a picture of an assembly of people, and very much looking at de Kooning, making sort of melee of wild marks. But gradually this settled down into something else, and it settled down into what you could call grisly expressionism, you know, blood-spattered Munch, Nolde, which is a language which I think most people would find completely unusable at that time. And I believe when this picture was wheeled out at the Slade diploma, someone I admire, Lawrence Guy, said, "Is he a bit simple?" So you have to come to terms with that you were doing absolutely, and I knew I was doing it. I had my painting space was right in the middle of the main room, the antique room, and I was getting comment every day. So I knew I was making the wrong moves, but I had to do it. And I had to put my adolescence on my sleeve in a way. So these are all the people in my life. My twin brother is there, my Coldstream himself is there. My ex-art teacher from school, you know, and it's me on the ceiling, of course. So it was an unwise move, but I'm very glad I did it. And it went on for a long time, and it did in the end yield some interesting attention too. But to give you an anecdote of the period, the dominant teacher when I was at the Slade probably was Harold Cohen. I don't know if any of you have even heard of Harold Cohen.
Yeah.
But anyway, Harold Cohen, and he was a terror. And I remember taking this picture. I signed up for a tutorial, taking this very heavy picture up the stairs into his room. And as I came towards the door, a woman, a rather beautiful young student, came out weeping. And I took it in, and he looked at me and he looked at the picture. He said, "Right, I'm just going to ask you one question, and if you don't want to answer it, you can leave the room. Are you a homosexual?" I said, "I don't know. I was 19, I didn't know." He said, "You mean you're not making it on any scene?" He was shocked. So then he said, "Now, I'm going to speak to you. What do you think painting is for?" I said, "Maybe it's got something to do with therapeutic thing." So, "Oh no, Jesus Christ, this is like a hospital in here." He was appalled. He said, no, painting is about making a making." Okay, so the whole thing was terrible. And luckily I was left sort of inchoate, and I'm very glad I didn't sort myself out at that point too decisively. But I mean, it was a fair question. There was my mother in the foreground. That was Derek Jarman, by the way. The person I liked best in my year was Derek Jarman, and he was a very interesting person. I knew him to his death, more or less, but I knew him best in those first years, before he came out, actually. I always told him I felt like his maiden aunt. Anyway, there we are. That's my older brother. Keep going. Next one. In the matter of drawing, I couldn't get on with Euston Road drawing. We did, each Friday in my first year, we sat in front of the model with Hugh Newglow, who, funny enough, didn't really teach. I mean, I think he taught if you wanted to be taught, but I didn't know what to ask. And it was I never found a way of drawing in a life room that I was comfortable with. I still can't. I don't know what I'm doing there. So that didn't work for me. But the artist who did have tremendous charisma, and who the few times we spoke always said very interesting things, was Frank Auerbach. And so, that's very obviously, don't you think, a parody Frank Auerbach drawing, 1969, two years after leaving the Slade. So that would be one of my starting points. And there is this rather wonderful thing that Auerbach said, that he wanted to draw as though you just had an argument and all the stock of lies had been exhausted and you were going to tell the truth. Something like that was feeding my aesthetic at that time. But again, I can hardly dare to put a line around anything. And so it was quite a few years before I felt it was okay to make a more descriptive, less of an exclamatory drawing. And I would say that drawing on the whole has fed me, and maybe Alison was referring to that, has kept me sane in a way. We come back to that. Keep on. Another one. Yeah. I should say, I was brought up in a privileged world that believed it was rich. It wasn't, in fact. They got shipwrecked. But I was brought up in Belgravia and Chelsea, mostly, with one or two dips already. But my parents were sort of kind of feckless, and I didn't like their world from the beginning. I didn't, and in fact, none of the four siblings did. We were all very strongly leftist. My father was very conservative, very conformist. My mother was thoughtless, and already within my first year at the Slade, I couldn't bear living at home, and I did force the pace and move away to a part of London where they'd never set foot, near Holloway Jail, and remained there after leaving the Slade. But it was very bleak, and I wanted it to be bleak. That was what I needed. But then at a certain point, that house was demolished, and folk to me, I didn't really have any income to speak of. And so they'd just acquired a kind of country cottage with a forge attached. Now, they only used this country cottage about 5 weekends in the year and a bit, maybe one longer stay, but they were hardly there. And this forge was lying unused. So I moved in for the summer. I stayed 10 years. I was the Van Gogh at the bottom of the garden. It was terrible. Why did I do that? I had to live in ascesis in some way. I wanted to have no possessions. I wanted to be Prince Mishkin. Some of you read, I wanted to be a sort of holy fool. I was interested in St. Francis. So all those things, I mean, it was totally, I did paint every day, more or less, except that the void got in the way. And so I wasn't very productive. I was destroying much more than I was painting. But it was one way of spending your difficult 20s. And just when I left the Slade, I was asked by Coldstream whether I would like to give a series of lectures on 20th century painters at the Working Men's College, which was rather an interesting place in those days because it still had the mantle of Ruskin and William Morris and so on. And there were sort of idealistic civil servants teaching there for free and so on, and very, very, very interesting, ardent young students. So really not much older than them, I was having to be sure that I was one step ahead of them, as it were, and I would spend one day a week, perhaps, reading everything possible on Mondrian and really having to come to grips with Mondrian and getting very excited about him, preaching the gospel of Mondrian at one point. So, it was a real education. I had to come to terms with modernism, and little by little, the list changed. Now, I'm telling you all this because I think the real narrative of a lot of what happened to me in my 20s was discovering that the standard account of whatever you like to call it, modern art, which roughly went Cézanne to Cubism, Cubism to Mondrian, Mondrian to American painting. That's what I grew up with. I don't know whether anyone else did, but that was more or less the way it was told in my childhood, really, from there onwards. My parents had no interest in art, but they'd say my school account would be that. Was untrue. I simply just began to realize it was untrue. And so quite a lot of my energies went into really finding out about Max Beckmann or Otto Dix or Althus. Okay, these at that point totally unfashionable figures, at least in England, and they've gone on. I've gone on. I mean, I'd never heard of Alice Neal, to my horror, till long after her death. She died in 1980, at the age of 80. I didn't know about Alice Neal. I'm fascinated by her. So that sense of discovering an alternative cast list is one of the big things in my life. Stanley Spencer, when I was at the Slade, despite all, they had a wonderful painting by him, but he was unmentionable. It was a joke to talk about Stanley Spencer. And I didn't challenge that. But by the end of giving these talks at the Working Men's College, maybe 6 years later, so I would come up and do my little lecture for which I was paid, I don't know, £1.10, and have a Greek meal afterwards in Camden Town. But Stanley Spencer did come into that list eventually, and so did Beckmann and quite a few others. So it became a bit less conventional, the list. But it tended to culminate with American painting, because I didn't have anything much else to offer. So it's a very interesting question to me, looking back. How does one cope with the current list? a key artist. Let's go forward now then. Go forward. Yeah. Well, the Beckmann triptychs.
Yeah.
You see, my last year at the Slade, there'd been a show at the Tate. It was the worst, it's the least attended show they've ever had. Hardly anyone went. People never heard of Beckmann in England. And I went only really because Geoffrey Camp, who was an important influence on me later in life, but he said, you know, Tim, I think you ought to go and have a look. It's interesting. So I decided I would. It was one of the last days of the show, maybe the last day. And at first I thought, this can't be serious. I mean, there's ridiculous, fleshy, complex figure paintings. I mean, we've gone beyond that. And then the penny dropped gradually. It was I had to take it on. I had to take it seriously. And it wasn't all in one go. I mean, little by little, Beckmann kept cropping up in different places. And eventually, when I went to New York, there was a wonderful moment at the Museum of Modern Art where you had Departure and Guernica in sight of one another. And it was very, very interesting to work out how you related to those two great statements. So the possibility of complexity in a way of John Cooper Purse made flesh in painting was one thing. And the more I read about Beckmann's writing as well, it was fascinating, very articulate. Let's go on, another one. And the other great figure was the last works of Léger. I did get to Biot. I don't know if anyone has been to the Musée Léger at Biot, but it's a revelation. And that painting is there. It's about 9 foot tall, and has such resonant. I mean, for me, it is the return of the Golden Age. That's what it's about. And he's been through the void. He's been through abstraction, and he's come out into this around 1950. This post-cubist assertion of liberty and hope, and I really fell in love with Léger.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a lot to dislike about Léger too. And I had earlier thought these black lines were horrible, and the flat color and the lack of touch and blah blah blah. So that was one starting point for me. And I've actually made Léger a sort of second introduction in my book because he was very articulate. He wrote extremely well, and he thought a lot as a person of the left about what the real function of painting should be and could be. And I just read you a little passage which I love. He was close to Le Corbusier, but he was close to Le Corbusier and Buckminster Fuller and Alvar Aalto. He worked with all of them. But he was very disappointed by the architects. They didn't really use him. And quite late in life, he goes to an architectural conference and he says, "My architect friends, we should be able to get together about this wall." The wall is the point. That the salvation of painting could be through the wall. So we should be able to get together about this wall. You want to forget that painters are brought into this world to destroy dead surfaces, to make them livable, to spare us from overly extreme architectural solutions. Out of pride, you haven't wanted to call in the painter who is waiting at the foot of the stairs. He is waiting for your decisions. So that's where I was in a way. I felt that would be that, and I still feel that. I still feel I was programmed for something like mural painting. But it wasn't happening. It wasn't just me. I mean, I've talked to Patrick Caulfield about this. You know, he said, what wouldn't we do for a mural commission? Bacon wanted to paint a painted room, but we don't get that, do we? Because the language of, by and large, the language of 20th century architecture has no place for painting. It's directly opposed to it. It's all about creating voids of glass and emptiness. So I feel this strongly, and I've tried to say it a bit at the Royal Academy, which is the one place where artists and architects might meet, but I don't think they will. I think I think that will take another generation at least. But that's my hope, actually, seriously, that the function of painting could be transformed. We don't want to be trophy works for stupid oligarchs and silly people in art fairs. You know, that's not what we became painters for.
No.
So the question of function is lurking all the time, and the question of the sense of futility that can be there for most painters, I think. But okay, onwards. So I began to write. I began to write, and one of the first essays was on Léger. But unfortunately, I also made a terrible mistake that I became taken over by black lines, and worse than black lines, just black everything. And for about 4 years, I painted paintings that might have had something in idea. They're not so different from things I would do now, except that this black took over, and flatness and whatever. So this is about my first trip to India. My host was meditating in front of me to the mountain, Arunachala, which is a sacred mountain. And here I am, as it were, watching her. But the language kills it. Okay, another one. And I found a way, I think, gradually out of that stultifying language. And one of the people who helped me was Howard Hodgkin. Now, oddly enough, when I was painting The Party, Robin Denny liked that painting. You probably don't know who Robin Denny. Robin Denny was the most famous abstract painter of his period, and the Tate had a huge retrospective, wonderful catalogue. But within his lifetime, he was totally forgotten. And I think a lot of people here won't have heard of Robin Denny. He's dead now. He died quite recently.
Yeah.
But anyway, Robin Denny was at that point a friend of Howard Hodgkin. He said, "You really ought to meet." And I couldn't face it. I couldn't even think of. I was much too contorted at 20 to think of meeting any known artist. And I didn't actually know artists until, I would say, in my late 20s. I didn't go to private views. I was very isolated. But by chance almost, I did get to know Hodgkin, and we walked a lot. We had a lot of interesting conversations, and he was at his best. He could be delightful, and we walked through the city at night, looking in at people's windows, which is his favourite activity. And this is called Conversation in a Taxi, and it's mocking his language a bit. But I think you get the drift. So that would be about 5 years after leaving the Slade, maybe 6 years. Another one. And that's a small picture, a number of pictures about being at a performance, at the theatre, at the cinema. Still interested in that theme. This is called Dr. Faustus at the Fortune Theatre, which is a very small theatre, so it's a very confining space. And I think it's obvious that I'm finding my touch, by finding ways of speaking in a more relaxed and enjoyable way. Another one. Then something very weird happened to me. Well, I'd become close to Kittai. I'd seen this painting and fallen in love with it and written about it, published about it. And he got in touch, and I began to get to know him pretty well. But I was still as I say, living in the country, very isolated, living in Sussex, in fact. And out of the blue, I suppose because of writing more than painting, although I was just beginning to be seen a bit as a painter, but I was asked, would I be interested in curating a kind of anti-Art Scribe show. I mean, Art Scribe was the house magazine of a certain kind of informal English abstraction, which I wasn't at all sympathetic to, but for some reason they kind of got me to be their token figuration artist. So anyway, this was a representative of Arnold Feeney, which was then a very prominent gallery. It was just been founded in Bristol, lovely spaces. And this gradually became a bigger thing. The show that resulted was called Narrative Paintings. That was my title. They wanted to call it postmodernism. I didn't like that. I didn't want it to be postmodernism. So the cover was this painting, which is called If Not Not. Now, I should say that I'd found Kittai earlier a difficult artist. I'd responded viscerally to Hodgkin. I felt terribly excited by these pictures. But with Kittai, what really helped me was reading Ezra Pound and realizing that Kittai, little by little, was kind of finding pictorial equivalences to that complex system of reference or literary complexity. I think a lot of you will know this, but there's a famous, earlier than this picture, he was asked, why are your pictures so literary? Which was a bad thing to be in the 60s, to be literary, or even the 70s. And Kittai said, well, some books have pictures and some pictures have books. And I think it's a very good reply. I think a lot of pictures of all periods have had books. And it's a rich thing. It's not something to be ashamed of. So anyway, that was helpful to me. And the book in this case is The Wasteland, really. It's a picture that is about the wasteland. Anyway, so that was one kind of picture that I wanted, if you like, to collect together. Pictures that had books that were altarpieces, complex. But the back cover, next one, the back cover was Ken Kiff's talking to a psychoanalyst. And I got to know, speaking with a psychoanalyst. And I got to know him well. Again, he'd hardly exhibited. And I've lived all my life. I've got a picture here, which I bought very, very cheaply. He very kindly let me have it very cheaply when I was, in my 20s. And it's never failed to delight me. And the works that I really love by Ken are the sequence, which I imagine some of you may have seen in Norwich 2 years ago, or maybe seen the catalogue, which are acrylic on paper. And I think he does something so wonderful with acrylic that no one else has really so far done. And that actually he probably can't do with oil in quite the same way. But anyway, and I suppose the contrast between those two pictures is in a way almost a conflict in me between the aspiration to something very, well, let's call it altarpiece or wall, and something much more intimate, some psychological or self-exploratory quality that I think I would also want in my art. And so that was a sort of internal dialogue. And the show came out of that, and I think it was an interesting show. It was a bit of a mess. The old monster sacre of the English art world of the day was called Vera Russell. And she said to me, some of those young people of yours need to be put back in the oven for a bit. They were half-baked. But it was the first time Andrew Joukowsky showed. Quite a lot of artists I'm interested in were. And it also included Bhupen Kaka, who I'd come to know in London. I hadn't met him in India yet. I had been to India, but I hadn't met him then. Let's go on. So it was a workshop. This is about a year later. I went to India. I'd been sent by the Arts Council. In a sense, I'd been taken up because of this show. The show went to the ICA eventually from Arnold Feeney, and the ICA was a very good venue in those days. I'm afraid we don't go to the ICA, most of us anymore. But the Institute of Contemporary Arts, it's a back number really for painters now, but it wasn't then. It was where a lot happened. Yeah. And Bhupen Kaka was a very lovable, interesting person who quite a number of people in the audience knew well, including Alison and Andrew, I suppose, and Debbie, who's here. And he was immobilized. He'd broken his leg, his crutches under the bed. And so he was a wonderful person to just sit and draw. And I did sit and draw him. And then I found that I was living in a guest house, the university guest house, giving my lectures and getting deep into Indian cultural life, really. Next one. Then I found that I wanted to paint a painting. So I would come back from drawing and make this painting a bit clearer, because it's not painted from him, it's painted from the memory of him. And it's about his relationship with, which was typical of his loves. His great loves were always for elderly, one foot in the grave, dreary men who he loved and who he did everything for. And it was very touching and interesting. He was a gerontophile, essentially. I think I felt I'd said something in that picture. So that was one of the first pictures I showed in a one-person show. Another one. Well, let me just go back. As it happens, that show was bought by someone I'd known slightly in the distant past, but never been quite sure of my relationship, who was in fact Judith Ravenscroft, who had become my wife. So, it was it was the thing that gave me confidence to, as it were, court Judith, that she bought that painting. So it played an important part in my life. Another one. And this is much later. Beckmann would paint about his relationship with Mr. Vallabhbhai and other similar people under the name of an Indian myth, Yayati, which comes into the Mahabharata, huge mythical accumulation, where an old king becomes impotent and asks his son, the prince, to give him his youth. And I remember this painting I saw on the easel, and Beckmann thought it could never be exhibited. This is about 6 years later, mid-80s, I think, or even late 80s. And so I rolled it up and I took it home across the oceans, as it were, and had it above our bed for about 5 years. And I think it's a wonderful picture. And I remember Norbert Linton seeing this picture and said, "Oh, so that's how it's done." Anyway, Beckmann was a very life-enhancing friend in every way, and led to an association with really some of the closest artists in my life have been Indian artists. I won't go into it in depth, but it's a big strand in my life. Another one. Another slide. So Judith then entered my life, and by then, again, it all suddenly, after 10 years of stasis, of being completely out of it, really, suddenly everything happened. I suddenly had a one-man show. I was offered a flat in the middle of Soho at £25 a week rent. It was a miracle. And within about 6 months, I was courting Judith, who married not very long after that. And my life changed. I think these things do happen to people in their 30s quite often, after long waits. Another one. That gives you some sense. Yeah. This one is called Great Pulteney Street, She Says Yes. It was just remembering the first moment of assignation, finally plucking up courage as I moved down the street. And something about that combination of place and narrative event was what I wanted from quite a lot of my work. Another one. And this is called Judith in Hospital. Judith had to have a hysterectomy quite soon, within about 3 years of our marriage, something like that. This is the... And I think I had a language for intimacy by then. Although it's a very drawn language, perhaps. Another one. I haven't mentioned Bonnard, who's terribly important in my story, and was certainly one of the artists I should have been mentioning as really pointing towards. I mean, it wasn't that Bonnard was unknown, but he was very, he was regarded as a second-level artist by most people I knew, because he was too easy. And I felt this was wrong. And it was pictures like this, when I finally saw them. I saw them in the 60s. This is 7 foot. I mean, do some of you remember seeing that? So he painted altarpieces, all right. They were to very intimate moments and very subjectivized moments with a very personal space that told, and eventually I would, in my book, I would talk, the middle chunk of my book is really called first person painting that is done explicitly as being about what you from the self. Bonnard sometimes puts a leg in or a hand, but there are many other ways of doing it. Beckmann does too. So that was a big thing in my life. This discovery that there was another kind of space that didn't lose the flatness of the painting, but gave you the intimate entry into the depicted world. Okay, one more. And this is the last slide, I think, before the break. So there were funny pictures I liked, but I would like to be painting like this again in a way, but this is just called Reading on the Bus. Some of you might be old enough to remember the kind of bus we used to have with a transverse seat that one always rather enjoyed sitting there. Okay. How are we doing?
Right, so we've come to the break and we'll just take a couple of questions from the audience. Could we possibly start with Adrian?
Yes, hello there. Hello, Timothy. Very nice to hear your voice and to see your work. And I've written down hundreds of notes here because I'm sure if we were in the pub, we'd be sitting for hours and hours, getting drunk, having a long conversation.
Sorry, Adrian, just speak slowly because I'm a bit deaf and the Glaswegian accent is not all that.
I know, it gets very broad. Sorry about that. Yes, okay. I'm saying I've written hundreds of notes here because there's so many things to talk about. I'm up here in a small village outside of Glasgow, and the reason I'm living here is because I want to be away from the arts market, which is London and other places, because in a way it can be distracting and over influential. And I got some idea of that from yourself when you decided to go and live in this in Norfolk. Is that it? It was Norfolk, and it was in the cottage. In a way, you had to go away and create a void, empty your head of all these.
But Adrian, it's very different for you because you had that early exposure to the market,
yes.
almost without trying. Isn't that right? I mean,
that's right. Well,
straight from the art school into the world of selling and showing.
Yes. Well, the thing was in Glasgow, nobody bought art, so we weren't prejudicial. We weren't prejudiced against any kind of art, so we could talk about abstraction. I was a big fan of Robin Denny, and a big fan of all kinds of art, the abstract expressionists and cubists and Vuillard, Bonnard. So from my perspective, I could talk to my friends about these artists. As
I mean, as you probably know, I taught with Sandy at Glasgow quite a bit, so I knew.
Yes.
I gave quite a lot of lectures at Glasgow. I mean, every year I would come up for 2 or 3 days.
Was that after I left?
Sorry?
Was that, when was that? Was that in the 80s?
Well, that would be at the time of the narrative painting show and just before and after, for several years. So the roughly 78, 79, 80, 81, 82.
Oh yeah. I would have been
so
there.
I knew all those people quite well when they were students.
Yes.
And I mean, there was definitely a shared canon, which was the alternative canon. Glasgow was one of our happy hunting grounds, as it were. We were trying to convert people, but it may not have worked out. You see, I mean, that's what one can feed people: Stanley Spencer and Leger and so on. But it doesn't mean to say they're going to be able to run with it for more than a few years.
No. Not exactly.
And as you say, maybe then they have to isolate themselves and start again.
Always be isolated, I think. You can't have a perspective if you're in the middle of a crowded room.
Sorry, say that again.
You cannot have a perspective if you're in the middle of a crowded room.
No.
So you have to stand outside and have a look. You know, and I think that's important for all people to do. And go to Italy and go on a tour and go and see Lorenzetti and Siena, etc.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. That's an antidote.
Yes, exactly. We need a bigger picture of things.
And I mean, I'm not going to talk about it, but I am looking right now a lot at English medieval art, especially the manuscripts. And it's wonderful. It's ridiculous that we don't know more about that, any of us.
That's true. Well, we destroyed a lot of it with the Reformation.
Terrible. It's terrible.
Terrible, these structures. I'm a big fan of Nicholas Hilliard.
Hilliard is really wonderful, isn't he?
He's a great artist and a big influence on me. And I thought he might be influential on yourself because there's a melancholy in his work, which is in miniature, but it's just so much bigger than the miniature frame that holds it. You know, and it's a great thing. Unsung hero, Nicholas Hilliard, not appreciated as much as he should be. You know, but great poetic painter. You know.
But I mean, in a way, he's a wonderful artist, but he's very confined. But I mean, the things that one finds now in English manuscripts right through for about 300 years are so ambitious and magnificent, complex.
Yes. I know, fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, a big fan of. I think these things have been rediscovered now. Don't you think that younger artists are looking elsewhere?
I think they are. They are.
Because I think that straight line that you talk about is a bit bogus. You know, the fact that now we've got and the fact that you can draw a straight line means there's something wrong with it. You know, in art history. To say that follows that. And
I mean, we now know, I didn't want to bring all that in, but we now know that the CIA did make an actual propaganda because they thought it would discomfort Soviet aesthetics.
Oh, abstract expressionism.
Yeah.
Yeah, the CIA were behind that, behind Jackson Pollock.
So, you know, we're always duped by all sorts of political angles.
Yeah, well, there's a link between the British Council and propaganda as well, and how we promote ourselves abroad. You know, so as long as we're all aware of when we're being used. Yeah, it's a complicated subject. I'm not sure this constitutes a question. It's more of a conversation. But there was one thing that one point you talked about was architecture and how they don't find spaces for painting. And there's a great pavilion designed by Le Corbusier which holds the paintings of Fernand Léger, Ozenfant and Le Corbusier himself, because Le Corbusier saw himself as an equal to any painter.
I think he was a ghastly painter, personally, but there it is. I think he should have used Léger every time.
Yeah, no, he should have. But
I find Ozenfant really academic.
Yeah,
academic
right boring.
Yeah,
I know, exactly. But that's it. That's it. Because there's egos involved, you know. And I talked to an architect once who said, "Why would I employ an artist when I am an artist myself?" You know. So.
Well, he was a visionary, wonderful architect, and I love Ronchamp Chapel and many things that Le Corbusier did. But I don't think he was a painter.
No. Well, he painted in the morning and did his architecture in the afternoon. That was designed cities in the afternoon, Chandigarh, etc. Yeah. Anyway, so somebody else waiting to ask you a question because I feel as I'm dominating this, but yeah, you look well. I must have gone to all your lectures then at the art school, because I must have gone to all your lectures at the art school, because I never missed a lecture.
Yeah, well, Sandy certainly sort of, pushed me forward, as it were.
Yeah.
I remember them. I remember them, Tim.
Yeah.
Yes, I remember your lectures. I remember quite a few people came up. Actually, Leonard Beckmann came up as well.
Yeah.
Big fan of Leonard Beckmann, great artist. Yeah, I mean, there have been an awful lot of good artists who get pushed to one side, but you've just got to carry on.
But it's true that Glasgow was exceptional, I think, in its relative separation from the hard line, as it were.
Yes.
I mean, you have to realise, literally, every artist in my year around me was using masking tape.
Yes.
I mean, it's only a slight exaggeration, but the degree to which very often in art schools people are totally conformist at any one moment, it's amazing to watch.
Yeah.
I think that's why it's really important to have a range of teachers teaching, and not just one kind of teacher is doing a certain kind of work.
Yeah, that's right. A house style.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shall we move on now, Tim?
Move on, Tim.
Thanks, Adrian.
Okay.
My pleasure. I'm enjoying the talk very much.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we can move on now, Tim.
Yep, fine.
All right.
Right. I'm gonna leave.
Okay. So this is called Middleton Square, Springboard of London. Now, I'm talking now about something a bit difficult in a way. I'd say that we all, at certain points, enter into a sort of calm phase of one's life, where maybe one has a gallery showing one's work. One's personal life is calm, enjoyable, happy. In my case, we'd moved almost. I had a year as an artist in residence at Lincoln Cathedral, but we could keep on the rented flat. And then I moved almost seamlessly. It was the Thatcher era, and it became pretty obvious that rented flats. It was a very small. We had to fold our bed away every morning. It was a very small flat, and we both inherited something like, I don't know, in those days 40,000 each, and we decided we would have to buy somewhere, or else we were just going to fritter away all that money. And so we bought the flat I'm still in. This is where I still am, which was in Middleton Square, and it's absolutely perfect for me. I want to die there. But so I became a householder, which I'd, in a sense, set my heart against as a young man. And pretty soon, as happens, I think the calm of it all caught up with me, And I would say that well, there were. I felt it's a square, a sloping square, high on a hill above King's Cross, above the city. Originally, from my doorstep, I could see the whole dome of St. Paul's, just like that, with the drum, just from my doorstep. It was developed, to my horror. This happened about 3 or 4 years after I moved in. But the sense of ownership of London was very strong, and of coming back to London after, my childhood was in London. Then I had these 10 years as the Van Gogh at the bottom of the garden. So this sense of launching into the world. But pretty soon, I think midlife crisis occurs. And in my view, and this will be bad news to one or two people in the audience, it hits you at 46. I warn you. And it obviously has to do with many factors, one of which, in my view, is the death of one's parents, or if not death, the decrepitude of one's parents. In my case, there were other factors. My twin brother became ill, eventually died. So at some point between perhaps 1995 and 2005, or 2000 anyway, life was pretty difficult, pretty hard. Let's go on. And I think my art was forced to take on a different dimension. This is a picture called, well, anyway, it's a retelling of the St. Christopher image, where you carry this, you carry this child figure, let's call it inner child or whatever, on your shoulder, and you somehow have to cross that stream, the Thames, and with all this rubbish, all this demonic misfortune that you're wading through. So that's really what it's about. And I couldn't use myself. I couldn't at this point put a self-portrait in. So I used John Cooper Purse, the writer I've told you about, as a self, just as an aside. Okay. Sorry, it's called Mid-River, the bearer, which Christopher just means Christ bearer. Christopher. I'm not a Christian, but I'm interested in the world of religion. Okay, another one. So these are attempts to sort of take on the whole of London, as it were. In a great metropolis, you can feel that it's completely enclosed by it. And being in this square tended to facilitate that. It was good, whatever direction I walked in, it was full of towers and you saw things rising up. Part of my childhood was Hampstead, St. Pancras at the bottom of the street, and so on. So, nevertheless, having started, it's quite a big, maybe 6 foot or more circle. The problem for me always, when I love circular pictures, but they're notoriously difficult to conclude because and I suspect in the past that some of the great circular pictures of the past have always had many layers of framing, and I hadn't done that. So I stalled. I kept having trouble finishing this picture. It went on for about 10 years. And what broke the stalling was that someone gave me a sort of residency on the Millennium Wheel, which we now call the London Eye. And they basically gave me a sum of money which I could spend on just going round and round in circles and getting that sense of being above London. So I think that gave that gave a new possibility to the as it were, completing the circle. Okay, oh. Another one. And this is just part of a little book. I possibly should have shown more of this, but there was a little book which I dedicated to Bupin Kaka after his death, of small, very small watercolor vignettes, and it did come out as a limited edition, printed in India, in Ahmedabad. But so I felt I'd internalized London. Another one. And part of that was making lots of drawings. Around 2000, I was recruited by I'd become slightly, I taught at the Slade a few days a year for years and years, sometimes more, sometimes less, sometimes once a week, sometimes 4 days a year or something. But I was rather disillusioned, I think, and also at the Royal College, where I taught Debbie, for instance. But I don't know if I really felt terribly at home. The way that art education went in England, with recruiting Asian people for money, basically, just to keep, or the Slade destroying its studios, really, building hideous mezzanines, just to cram in more students. It just seemed all so supine. It seemed to me that they should have stood their ground. And I think the whole fee-paying thing is disgraceful. When you think of all those old ladies in the 19th century giving money so that art schools, probably little crappy local art schools, could help some young talent to emerge free. They were almost always scholarship-based or free. And somehow all this got swallowed up in a horrible university managerial system, which is totally money-oriented. And so I was open to being recruited to this funny organization, which was then called the Prince's Drawing School, or the Drawing Year. And I had lots of reservations, but of course art students are the same everywhere. And these were all postgraduates, they'd all been through it. They were refugees from theory, a lot of them, by then. The theory had taken over from painting in a lot of art schools. It's a whole other subject, don't get me started. And so, and some of the other people involved, Christopher LeBrun, John Lesaw, were people I was sympathetic with as well, already knew. So eventually I began to take the students out drawing, which is something I'd rather been discouraged from doing at Slade. The Slade was a much more defensive situation where it would have seemed like a sort of back to school now in a way the whole basis of the drawing year is back to school. And so they have a sort of appetite, although they're postgraduate, they have an appetite to draw, just to draw. That's the whole point. So I could take people out, try and feed them the enthusiasm of being out in the world, seizing it, trying to seize the world as best you could, in all its wonky possibilities and speed and overlaps and so on, and enjoy it myself. And it got me drawing probably in a slightly different way. So week after week, probably, something like at least, say, 15 days a year, I was out there drawing with the students. They would scatter, but we would meet up 3 times in a day to see and I would show them my failures. Look, often I do fail and still do, but I think the sense of moving around with your pencil in the city accumulated and made me more again, the idea of internalizing the city. Okay, another one. A key picture for me was, in a way, begun, as I say, in the middle of midlife. My father had become senile. My mother had a terrible problem with diabetes and was more or less crippled. Howard Hodgkin used to say, he said, each time I see your parents, Tim, they look more and more like deposed European royalty, which very much characterized them. I mean, they were ridiculous, my parents. And my older brother, another kind of monster, my twin brother began to develop cancer from which he died. My sister had breast cancer. You know, the whole sense of this family, the oppression of it all, and me hiding behind the painting, which I always had done in a way, that's what it was about. And I'd seen wonderful Chagall drawing, very early drawing, with just more or less that. That was the basis of my idea that sparked off the composition. But anyway, it went on for years, and I still think it's one of my most meaningful pictures. Okay, another one. It's big, 6 foot. And this was an attempt at something more ambitious, and it was one of a sequence, actually. I mean, I tried the theme. I'll just have to speak about this a little bit. I don't think a lot of people know this parable, but to me, by far the most interesting parable that Jesus speaks is the one called Dives and Lazarus. And it's in Luke, I think, chapter 11, and it goes roughly like this, that there's a rich man, he has three meals a day of purple and fine linen, and at his door is a beggar, who the name Lazarus means he's a leper. The dogs came and licked his sores. So a lot of these phrases, purple and fine linen, dogs came and licked his sores. Okay, it's quite a brief text. The beggar dies and he goes up into Abraham's bosom. Meanwhile, Dives dies, rich man, Dives, and he goes to hell. And there aren't many references to hell, funny enough, in either the Old or the New Testament. But anyway, he goes to hell, and he looks up, and he says, he sees Dives in the sky. He sees Lazarus. He sees the beggar in the sky, and he says, "Can't you help me? Can't you?" No, he said, "No, there's a great gulf fixed. There's a great abyss between the rich and the okay, great gulf fixed. Well, can't you at least go and tell my brothers?" He says, "No." He says, "They've got Moses and the prophets. If they don't believe them, they're not going to believe a man risen from the dead." It's a sort of Jewish joke. It's a tough joke. There's nothing to be done if the inequality. And I do feel that's a wonderful theme. I first came across it in Italy, actually. There's a very battered fresco in Bologna. And I thought, this is a possible way of building the cityscape and the mural side. This is 11 foot, and it's acrylic on paper. And I traipsed around with it. I painted it in Vermont, and I painted it in Israel, and and it was a very good part of my life in a way. But I don't think it's definitive at all. I think there's a whole other possibility now. I could tackle that theme again. So that would be, if I was given the chance to paint a mural, it probably would be something like London with the parable of Dives and Lazarus. It has been shown in a gallery, but it hasn't. I think it hasn't had its full chance yet. Okay. And just to say, I'm very interested in what's happened in the last few years, the way that painters, many of the most prominent painters, I'm thinking of people like Nicole Eisenman, Daniel Schutz, etc., have become women. I mean, some of the most prominent artists of our day are women. That wasn't so when I was growing up. That wasn't so. That by and large, partly because of the horrible machismo of both Picasso and American painting, women weren't supposed to paint. I mean, I'm putting it crudely, but I think it's true. And I think the apologies of the feminists of that period have not yet been received. It was very misleading. The art historians, all of them, they made it very clear that women should not paint. It was a disgraceful activity. And so right at the beginning of the century, you've got people like Paula Modersohn Becker, wonderful artist, Frida Kahlo, and Rilke thought it was all going to be very rich. We were going to have a century where women artists were at least as prominent as men. It didn't happen. Now it is happening. And I think the obvious icon for all this is Charlotte Salmon. And she's quite an amazing rediscovery for many people. I mean, Alice Neal is too in her way. But the way that I think all of us have responded to these, the most recent show was also beautiful, I thought, at the Jewish Museum in Camden. But I imagine most of you by now have been through Charlotte Salmon. There's a very fine book by Griselda Pollock, who I'm not always in sympathy with, but I think she's done wonderful work on Charlotte Salmon. So I just want to throw her in. I liked from the beginning the compartmented one, but I've come to like every aspect of it. It's astonishing what she does in her 20s. She creates a whole cycle of work in multiple languages, and it's a great novel with wonderful embodied images. Terrific. Another one. Just a drawing that tries to take on Cambridge Circus. My London really lies between the British Museum and the National Gallery. That's where I troll. And if the bookshops disappear, well, in a sense, I've lost a lot of my London. And I don't know if they're going to reappear after COVID. It's going to be terribly difficult. Anyway, so a certain kind of drawing that I think took hold, which was fully spatial, that where I was surrounded, is often made of two sheets to get in that panoramic. You know, this wonderful thing that Merleau-Ponty said. He said, "The world is not in front of us; it is all around us." I believe that, and I try and draw from that perception. Another one. The Lloyd's building is very enjoyable to draw. Another one. The amazing height now, ever higher, ever higher, that central sort of Bishopsgate area. I mean, the Gherkin is now tiny in the middle of all this. They're much higher than the Gherkin. And I found it very stimulating recently. I've been allowed up a number of towers, and I'm trying to take it all on. But again, I mean, what will happen now? Will the city simply collapse? Literally, maybe even literally. But we're living in strange times. But anyway, I have felt excited by the sheer verticality of what's happening just in the last 6 years or 7 years. Another one. A picture that went on again for almost a decade was called Life Raft. And I suppose it's a picture that is again, I don't quite remember what I said at the beginning, but I mean, one tries to make a testimony which isn't like writing an obituary of oneself. It's a testimony. It's trying to watch. You watch your life unfolding. You watch it passing. You watch it. So it's the idea of birth to death and everything in between. My twin brother dying in 2000, as literally just about 5 days before the millennium. And you see, some idea of allegory is with me always, that one might be able to put a great number of different things together into a meaningful allegorical, can I say, trope, or not a conceit, I hope, Anyway, I'd been drawing one day on Westminster Bridge and looked down and seen this huge raft full of activity, any amount of activity, and suddenly it came to me that this was a way of encapsulating within a spatial setting a life. Okay, my parents, being born with my twin brother, Beckmann is there. Okay, let's go on. And this is a funny one. This is something my assistant wanted me to put in. I'm very questioning about it. It's again a picture that's gone on much too long. It's called Kneeling Before the Altar of the Unknown God. You know, it is said in the Acts of the Apostles that in Athens there was an altar to the unknown God. Nobody quite knows what that means, but it suits me fine. I mean, I don't know what, I do pray. I can't stop myself. I've sometimes had people shrieking at me saying, you mustn't, but I do. And I don't know what I'm praying to. And I want to try and hold on to some sort of, there's some value system somewhere that one is being dragged upwards. And as I've hinted before, I think that I'm not interested really in despair as such. I'm interested in what happens after despair when the hope returns. And I found it very interesting voices speaking explicitly about that. The most interesting recently is a philosopher called Ernst Bloch, who deserves to be better known, in my view. I mean, he's a sort of Marxist classic with a very strange, very personal voice. And I've got a lot from just looking at his weird book. He was a friend of Walter Benjamin and a lot of people you will have heard of, Frankfurt School and so on. But he's got his own hope. The book is called The Principle of Hope. So that's where I place myself right now. Okay, one more. Oh yeah, I unexpectedly found that I had something like 3 heart murmurs, and they decided, again unexpectedly, that they would work on the valves, which meant open heart operation, which sets you back for quite a while. I think I've totally recovered, but that was about 2.5 years ago. Again, unexpectedly, about a year after that, just over a year after that, rather too soon, I suddenly had a gallstone blocking my gut, which was an emergency. So I was rushed into hospital. I probably would have died. As the surgeon said about it, he said, everything that should have gone south went north. I was just vomiting huge amounts of black melancholy, black bile. And that took longer to recover from. And one of my responses on each occasion was, I would like to get back into painting in a new way. I mean, I've always got about 30 paintings on the go. I have 2 studios, one at home and one further east. And I begin things and put them aside and take them up again. So I've always got things on the go, but I wanted, for all the reasons I've been telling you, I wanted to just try the mural scale. And I thought it would be much easier to do it with somebody. So a woman I knew had suggested that we showed together at Transition Gallery, which is a sort of cave-like space. And we decided to just do, in watercolor on paper, a mural. We had about 10 days, and it was fun to do it. Another one. And then this is a more ambitious one. In a way, 3 of us, 3 generations. The first one was with Lucy Ayres. This is with Lucy Ayres again, and Perianne Christian, who maybe some of you know. And the 3 of us together set out to make a tree of life. Now, we only had 5 days where we could all be working together. And that's pretty much the limit of what we could do. But have we got the little automation thing? Andrew? Oh yeah, it's just fun to see. my own view is that if there is going to be a modern mural art, it will have to be partly collaborative. And it could be men and women working together, and it could be different generations. And I'd love to see more of it. I'd probably love to do more of it, really. But it is a big undertaking. And just that damn ladder getting in the way of everything. You know, the actual, do you do scaffolding? You see what I'm getting at? It's quite, the actual physical problems crop up quite soon. So that did get me back into painting. And I am, again, for obvious reasons, I'm interested in the idea of making, let's cover another one now, of making paintings that are also drawings. We'll have another slide, Okay, so this was in last year's Royal Academy. Now, for the first and only time, something I'd avoided ever since being elected was getting involved in the summer exhibition, partly because whatever you do, the summer exhibition is going to be ghastly. That's my view. But I was allowed to have my own room. And by chance, Jock McFadden, who was in charge of the whole thing, had already invited one of my best friends, the sculptor John Davis, to put in a huge sculptural group. I should have had a slide of this, I'm sorry. But so from the beginning, I knew that this would be I had small paintings as well, but this would be my big painting. And it takes on a theme that I've been interested in for years, that at a moment of despair about 25 years ago, I opened the Bible. I don't often open the Bible. And I opened it at random, and I came across this quotation: "Thou also, son of man, take the attire and portray upon it the city." Just left off the page. And it's the last place you'd expect to find it, because, you know, you think of Old Testament prophets as being iconoclasts and against the image and so on. But no, God actually tells Ezekiel to take a tile and portray upon it the city. And then it goes on in a later phase of the story. "And it came to pass, as I sat in mine house, that the hand of the Lord fell upon me, and took me by a lock of mine head, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heavens, and brought me to the gate of the city." So I felt, and I still feel, that idea of being grotesquely lifted up by your hair and dangled above the whole of the city is made for me. And but it has this slightly, I'm afraid, unconsummated feel. I felt that, and it's a bit too light, and you know there are problems. None of us have been trained in making large non-easel pictures. I mean, it's much easier for me to work, of course, within a smaller scale, but certain fulfillments can happen, and it was very enjoyable. You live in hope while you're doing a big work. In a different way, you see them just knocking off a small work. You're not picture making, you're doing something else. Another one, just a detail. Yeah. Okay, carry on. We're almost at the end now. So I don't know if this looks sort of different now when you see it after all the others. I don't think I've got anything desperately to say about it now. Another one. Yep. And another one. I think that's enough, isn't it? Or shall I just say, well, I mean, this is again Middleton Square, where I live. This is an imagined, one's cell, as it were, one's despairing mornings. This is a sort of Judith figure as the figure of winged melancholia. And somehow between the two, one tries to build the passage of a life, moving through, partly with her, partly alone, to the horizon, as it were. Okay. Thank you. That's it, I think.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. That was absolutely fascinating and, great testament to your life's work. I mean, absolutely fascinating. We do have some questions in chat, so are you happy to answer some, or are you?
Yeah, I'm sure we've got a quarter of an hour, haven't we, or so.
Yep, sure. Okay, so just someone's asked, do you ever actually work from photographs, or are you always painting from life or from your inner eye, your imagination? What are your source material? How do you go about creating a big painting, for example?
Well, I mean, a lot of life as an artist is a gift thing, isn't it? I mean, you're given an epiphany in the street, or you're given an idea. And I mean, something in that way, it's like, I think it's very like what happens with poetry, the equivalent of you're given that first line that triggers a sequence. I think I found that over the years that I have to treasure very bad drawings sometimes, but nevertheless have an idea. I think maybe this is not relevant, but I love something that Judith Hyman, who I used to sit at his feet in my youth, he always used to say, "Good drawings make bad paintings," and it's something like that. I do now have. I probably should have brought one of those down. Big books of scrappy stuff that I found. I have drawers full of scraps, and some of them are still resonating, and there's possibility in them. So the actual thing of making good drawings in the street is only part of the story, and they don't necessarily translate into a worthwhile painting. Very often not, in my experience. And one can very easily misinterpret a drawing if you try and work directly from a drawing. I mean, Bonnard did it wonderfully, I think, but a lot can go wrong.
So when you're working on your large paintings, are you very much working from memory and imagination then, or do you ever? Are you very much working when you're working on your larger works? Are you working from memory and imagination? I mean, or do you ever refer to another?
I don't think it. I mean, I think I said this to you earlier in the evening that I would like it to be a seamless thing. I mean, I think in quite a lot of art, Goya. It's amazing to think of Goya painting a portrait probably the same day as he's painting the black paintings. You know, he did. You know. And I think that could be an ideal for a lot of us, that we don't have to have just one typical.
Sure. Yeah. So say, for example, if you wanted to put a bust in or the shard in, would you then go out and draw it from life, or would you look it up on
I'm having difficulty. Just speak very slowly. And
I'm asking for the benefit of students as well, who are often asking source material and how do you develop your images. So, for example, if you wanted to paint the shard or a bus, would you actually go and look at it and draw it from life, or look up a photograph? Are you averse to looking at photographs on the internet? And
yes, photographs. Yeah. Yes. The thing about photographs is, I mean, in theory, there's a lot of information there, but it isn't usable. Whereas the moment you make a drawing, the linear thing is immediately usable, and somehow the actual lens, to me, is not very like the human lens. I mean, it's amazing, actually, how a photograph diminishes things very rapidly. Well, I don't know whether it's a built-in zoom we have, but the kind of space that I'm getting when I draw is very unlike the photograph. And I do take photographs, and I love photographs. I love cinema, as I say, also. So I'm not against the lens, but it is different, I think. And of course, the other thing is that the experience of making the drawing, if it takes off, is in itself memorable. And it's a trigger, therefore, for even when you run into difficulties, you can, to some extent, get back through the drawing to the moment.
Right. Well, I think that's one thing that I really learned from you at the drawing school. The very first year, the first drawing year, was to draw from life without any prejudice, if you like, of any idea of what's going to be interesting. Just having that roving eye of just, gobbling it up really, and by the looking, it unfolds its treasures, it unfolds its secrets again and again and again by looking more deeply. I really was very influenced by that. So thank you. I think that was something that, well, you communicated that I seem to remember.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many ways to paint, so many ways to draw, but almost inherently, when you're out in the street, in the world, you have to be speed up, really. I don't think it is possible to make a lively street drawing without a relatively fast mark. And that is, I mean, the hand loses its cunning quite fast. If I don't draw for a few weeks, I lose it. So, this corny thing that Apelles is supposed to have said, no day without a line. I think there's something to be said for it.
And do you sometimes just make yourself draw, whether you feel like it or not, just as a practice?
I don't. I try and resist discipline. I don't actually have regular hours either. I wish I did in a way, but I mean, really, Alison, you have to imagine that my day begins full of hope, and then deteriorates very badly often to quite an advanced stage in the day, often after lunch and so on. I still haven't really got into it. And then if I'm lucky, something happens, the wall comes down. But I mean, that's been so for 40 years now. Nothing new about it. I'm very envious of people who, someone like Ken Curry, he used to tell me he had a first, second stage, a first, third stage, a fourth stage, exactly what he was doing, layer upon layer. It's not like that for me at all.
So is it quite agonizing then? Does it?
Well, it is each day, but as Plato is supposed to have said, or Socrates, pain and pleasure grow on the same tree, and that's very true of painting. We all find that the more pain, the more pleasure.
So have you ever tried a very clear routine and a clear structure? Have you ever tried that and it's just not worked for you?
What?
You tried a clear structure. Okay, I'm going to start work at this time and I'm going to have a break at this time.
Well, anyway, it goes against the grain. That's all I can say.
Yeah. No, I'm just curious because I think it's something that fascinates many people because
it's a very interesting issue, and everybody has to sort that out in their own way. Yeah,
that's really interesting that you do that. You're saying that everyone has to sort it out because there isn't just one way that's going to work for everyone. You have to get to know yourself and what's going to work for you.
I think quite a surprising number of artists, especially those who live alone, do work at night. I mean, Guston painted all his paintings at night, basically.
Yeah.
And someone like Geoffrey Camp, he basically lived a sort of relaxed day and then began to paint. And as the light failed in a way. But I think Peter Darrach is somewhere in this audience, and as far as I know, he never paints except by daylight.
Right.
And he has more ease of these days, anyway, of getting right into the studio,
right,
and just keeping working than almost anyone I know. Right through the coronavirus, he'd been producing pictures.
Amazing. Actually, I'm wondering if Melissa Keim or Peter Darrach would like to ask a question. We've got a nice comment from Melissa, actually.
Could I just quickly ask a question on the vein that you're talking about? Tim, do you find it to be the same case? Because you talked about when you're painting, you don't have a structured day, but you start very hopeful. You said earlier on that you start your day very hopeful. And it deteriorates. Do you find that to be the same thing when you're writing? Because you're quite an accomplished writer and author. Do you still go through the same vein?
No, not quite. It isn't the same. It isn't the same. No, it's much more. I mean, the writing is, after all, I'm basically only writing about art. I'm not trying to write a novel or a poem. I'm writing about art, and so the shirking might happen internally, where, in my view, the worthwhile bit in writing about art is when you really write about a particular work and your particular response. And you can shirk that in all sorts of ways. But it's not like, I mean, in my case, I really have problems just sort of setting foot in the studio. I'm terrified. I don't know what, I'm blocked, And a lot of the work, I have to say, a lot of the art I like best is partly about being blocked, and coming through. I mean, I think the blockage is part of the game for me, but I don't want it. I mean, I'd much rather just get straight down to it.
That's really, actually really interesting and inspiring to hear. There's many artists who, you mentioned about the literary used to be an accusation. And I know our Kitai was accused of being literary, and as Patrick Heron started writing a lot, but they all came through, didn't they, as visual artists? Do you think it's a manufactured problem, this idea of the artist as writer?
The artist as
writer also.
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, a hell of a lot of artists have written. It isn't that unusual, but in different ways. I mean, I like Wyndham Lewis's writing better than his painting, I admit. I think I probably like David Jones even slightly better. But I mean, Blake is obviously the greatest English writer and the greatest English painter. One, certainly among them. And but the Tate, all through my life virtually, anyway, since the age of 30, the Tate haven't been showing Blake properly. I think it was the greatest failure of Nicholas Sirota. He simply couldn't come to terms with Blake.
Thanks, Tim. That was so lovely. It was so captivating because I think I've looked up to you for so long, and it was kind of really lovely to hear your anxieties at being at art school, to just kind of see how you progressed and how your work developed. And I love that painting that you did of your friends when you first went to the Slade. It was so great. And also to see places that I've drawn with you. And I just wanted to say thank you for always being such a great support to me as well.
Thank you, Sue. Well, I think you're very good. I thought, anyway.
I think you're very good.
Oh, that's great.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello, Tim.
Hello.
It's really lovely to hear your talk. I have enjoyed that so much. There's a lot of content there, and it's very inspiring. I think what I've loved hearing about is the kind of your honesty of the difficulties at art school to start with, and how you kind of found a path through in a way that you've actually it's not that you've kept going, obviously you've kept going anyway, but the kind of question that I have is round about, it's maybe between the kind of writing and painting, and I'm curious to understand a bit more about your practice of writing and your practice of painting. And do you find that if you're doing a piece of writing or you're doing painting, do you find that you have to create a lot of space around that? Because one of the things I find, if I'm doing different activities, that I find that I have to kind of set aside time for doing one thing or another. So it's not that it would necessarily be the same for you, but I'm just kind of curious around, I suppose, how you maybe structure that.
Well, I can't pretend that it's smooth. It's not. I'm conscious of it as an ugly gear change. I hear the grinding of gears and screeching and so on. So, but I do sometimes manage in a day to, let's say, start the day with, maybe I wake at 6:30 or 7, right in bed, and then have a dead period of the day, and then get painting. You know, that would be a good day. Sometimes, of course, the writing becomes obsessive, especially if there's a deadline. If it's a commissioned article for a review or something for the TLS, you know, they're demanding it. Then things can get a bit out of hand, and I more or less do have to stop painting or. But you see, there's usually time to draw. There's usually time to sit and fiddle with images in some way or other. And I just think that the day can be quite long. But I don't have children. It makes a big difference. You know, there are all sorts of things that I can avoid. And I have a very kind wife.
Our families are very supportive of us. That's good to hear. That's very good to hear. And there's something, what I've heard in listening to you is like a really deep trust of the process of drawing and looking and keeping that going, like no matter what. So it's a bit like, that's the language. That's the kind of language that you're using to explore the world. And
it probably is. It probably is. I think the painting, the actual painting, has got. It's not that I don't paint, as it were, but I think the drawing, and I think really where things went wrong in my painting was when I tried to take the linearity out of it. I think I accept that there's a linear drawing element in my painting.
Okay.
But there isn't a lot of the artists I like. It's not, but I was glad, it was partly my doing and partly the publisher's doing, that the soutine went on the cover of that book, because that's so much, I still would love to paint like that and love to respond to another human being with that sort of total abandon of the, he apparently used 50 brushes in a session.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. If you'd like to raise your hand, please. Sorry. Yeah, I see Simon or Carol. No? Oh, Siklela. Unmute yourself. There you are. Could you unmute yourself, Siklela?
Yeah. Hi. Hello. Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you. I was just going to ask actually about the collaborations that you spoke of at the end. Do you still continue to paint like that? And how is that as an artist who, I'm guessing, was working on their own for many years, and how was that sharing? And
yeah, I think I think once you're confronted by that space and you've got your 5 days or your 10 days, whatever it is, you just have to do it. And it is a bit like a film shoot. And you muck in, you go for it. And you don't actually perhaps comment on we did divide the picture. Sorry, perhaps I should have said that. We divided the zones. The whole idea was to divide different zones. And there would be one zone where we overlap always, whether it's 3 or 2. So those are the rules, as it were. But we didn't at any point say, oh, at least we tried not to. And it went down very badly if there was ever a hint of that. I don't like that bit, can't you modify it? No, I don't think we did that. So it was in that sense, it was a sort of performative. It was performative in a way. Mm-hmm. But the question of who got the ladder at any one time, and could one person be up the top of the ladder and another person be on the second ring? Those things came up.
Okay, and was there a lot of planning before, or? No,
absolutely not. In fact, the whole point was, in a way, to make it as improvisation as possible.
Okay.
I had no idea, absolutely no idea what was going to happen in either case. That was, in a way, the fun of it.
Okay. No, it's thank you very much for the talk in general, obviously. And
okay.
As someone that really loves murals, and I was in Rome last year, and yeah, I'm just really fascinated by kind of how people have done that. I've sort of done something close to a mural, and I was just thinking about this idea of collaboration and like how that changes. So so thank you very much, and thanks for the talk. And
well, I've waited until I was 70 before I did any collaboration, so it is, it's new to me as well, but it somehow came about and it seemed the right thing to do.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot for references as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Did you feel it was quite a different experience working with other people? Obviously it's very different working alone in the studio. Did you feel it, I think there's a problem with being so solitary in the studio sometimes. Working collaboratively, as many artists did in the past in these big projects, painting churches and so on. Did you find that satisfied something in you?
It did. Deep down, I believe in community and collectivity and so on. So, and I also believe that there should be no hierarchy. One of the joys of my later life is having one morning a week I have somebody or other helps me assist, And I wouldn't mind using them more creatively, actually. But I wouldn't want to be Bridget Riley, where every mark is painted by somebody else. You see, I wouldn't want that.
I think it must have been a much less stressful experience being growing up as an artist in the guilds, and you're 14, being an apprentice, learning how to do things from scratch. You'd have a strong sense of being grounded in who you were as a craftsperson, really, and then growing into...
It does seem that way, doesn't it? It does seem a more healthy kind of apprenticeship. We like that. We do like that.
It's kind of a huge pressure on each individual artist to be something, say something very early on. It's a huge pressure on young art students to have something meaningful to say. You're 18, 19. I went to art school at 17 as well, and it was great in a way because you're getting a lot of skills under your belt, or a lot of experience under your belt, but I didn't have that much to say at 17.
I mean, just to come back to you, when you went to Baroda, you must have had a very different experience, because wasn't it rather more residential?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I was 29 when I went to Baroda, and I was absolutely ready and ripe, and to drink up these influences like Bhupen Kaka and Ghulam Sheikh, and it was just a treasure. 2 years of a gift. I absolutely loved it, and again, I have to thank you for that, because I didn't know anything about it.
I think you did good work there. I think it was good for your art. But Alison, I mean, this comes back. Have we got the art school system completely wrong here? I think we have. Yeah, I think it's I think it's got even worse as well. I mean, when I was at art school, actually, it makes people defensive rather than open. It's defensive. Everybody will tell you that it took them a long time to find. Yeah, well, I mean, I actually did have I really enjoyed my time at Glasgow, because I found, because there was a small enough staff-student ratio. Well, Glasgow's the exception, I think, because there is in Glasgow itself, it's a very communal city. Yes. It is much less cold than London. Yes. And less cold than Edinburgh, actually. Oh, cold, you mean weather-wise? No, I don't mean that, of course not. I mean human warmth. Well, I mean, Glasgow is a very, very warm city, and we really felt we were a family. And, Sandy was my tutor, and he grew us up. I mean, I was 18 when Sandy, I had him for two and a half years. And you felt that somebody had the time, because the staff-student ratio was so small. He was there 4 days a week. They even had studios on the premises. They had time to get to know you and nurture you. So it was a really positive experience. And I remember Sandy would... You see, Alison, I would guess that for Debbie, it was quite a shock to go from Glasgow to the Royal College, for instance, as a harsh thing, really. Yeah, I've heard of quite frequently people have found the Royal College very challenging, and not always in a way that they've had to kind of, in a way that challenge has made them stronger in the end, but it's always a difficult experience. But not just the Royal College, but I think I'm sure it's a wonderful art school in many ways. I think it's when you move away from that small community, where you're being someone that really has a chance to get to know you and understand, and you're can help you develop. When you move away from that to searing crits, where you have to defend every mark you make, and you're not allowed to make, or you feel you can't make a mistake because it's going to be torn apart. I think there's a balance to be had with all that, and it's not always, they don't always get it right. And I agree with what you're saying now about the overemphasis on critical theories. I would have loved to find an older artist who I could really learn from. And to some extent, I did find that eventually with both Hodgkin and Kittar and Joseph Herman and Geoffrey Campbell. I was very lucky in the end. But it took me into my late 20s before I did. Yeah, I think they're the lucky ones. If a student can find somebody they align with. I know someone I met was trying to do figurative work. I think it was a Slade. And everyone was doing abstract work around it, but they met Ken Kiff and they met Pella Rego, who sort of hauled them out to say, it's okay. It's okay to draw what's in front of you, what you're seeing, what you're experiencing figuratively. And that saved them. And if they hadn't met that person, they would have think, I'm not an artist. I always want to go home early. I want to go to bed early. I never want to do it. So I think you're lucky if you find that. Yeah. And I think that's what we're trying to do at ESOP, have a broad range of tutors so you can find your allies. I was going to say. Yeah. You can find your allies in this sense of small staff. Without being too heavy, I mean, Buddhism is another factor, isn't it? Your Buddhism. Another community. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And
and the correlation with meditation. But Beckmann was a massive help to me, actually, just in terms of his life and his philosophy and his work.
But you see, I mean, I don't know if he's still in the audience, but I think Peter Dirac is a perfect example of someone who didn't sit at anybody's feet, as far as I know, and or barely, and has come through splendidly.
Right. Yes.
Especially in his late years, perhaps. But all the interesting. I met him through the narrative show, and I don't think he'll answer questions about this. But anyway, he's not. One thing I left out, actually, which perhaps I should have mentioned, is that there was this period for about 5 years when a group of us used to meet on the South Bank about Sunday mornings, and it was, to me at least, helpful, even if it was a false illusion, rather like Instagram is a false illusion of community. And they were, Dexter Dallwood, who was one of the younger ones, called them the narrative nobodies. You know, but it included, I mean, funnily enough, Tracy Emin turned up for it, brought by Peter Dirac. I thought, you know, various stray people, but the core group was about 8, and it was a going concern, I think, to some extent. Although really all those people were very individual. Yeah. But I think I don't think you have to work like someone to sit at their feet, and I don't think sitting at someone's feet is always. It's more if they recognise your commitment, your passion, and then they help you nurture that and encourage that. I don't think you have to sort of want to work like them. And I think it was you who told me once, actually, that there's hardly any interesting artists have come out of a complete void. Maybe the odd outsider artist, but interesting. Well, that is really, you've got to take Henry Darger on board a bit. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, and there is a rule for this. I don't think there is a rule. Yeah. But anyway, in my case, art definitely comes from art. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you very much, Tim. Let me just wrap up. I just think you're such a beacon of honesty. It really, again, is a gift to be around that, because it encourages everyone to be more self-aware and to come from that basis of honesty in helping you develop as an artist and as an individual. I think you're so intelligent and honest. It's just a pleasure to listen to you. So thank you very much for giving us a talk tonight and letting us see your wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just fabulous. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good weekend. This is the last talk for this season, and the next talks we will start will be in September, beginning of September, but you will get due notice on this. For now, have a fantastic weekend and have a lovely summer, and stay safe and stay inspired. Thank you.
To you, Alison. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now you can go for a lovely swim in that sea behind you.
I shall attempt to do that.
Yeah, good for you. I wish I could.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.